They called it the Königstiger, the King Tiger, a machine so massive and intimidating that Allied soldiers believed nothing on earth could stop it. With its sloped armor thicker than anything fielded before and its deadly 88mm gun capable of destroying a Sherman from over a mile away, it seemed less like a tank and more like a beast carved from steel and arrogance. But the truth, discovered only when American troops captured several intact King Tigers, was far stranger and far more disappointing than the fearsome legend suggested. In late 1944, near the Belgian forests leading to the Battle of the Bulge, an American reconnaissance unit found something unusual. A King Tiger abandoned in the middle of a muddy road, its turret slightly angled, engine hatch open, tracks half buried. There were no shell holes, no burn marks, no signs of combat. It hadn't been defeated by Allied guns, it had simply quit. Engineers later discovered the issue. The tank's engine, originally designed for a 40-ton vehicle, was now trying to haul a 70-ton monster. The gearbox overheated, the suspension buckled, and the final drive teeth sheared off like brittle candy. The tank hadn't even traveled 5 miles before destroying itself. This wasn't an isolated case. On the Eastern Front, Soviet reports described entire platoons of King Tigers stranded before ever reaching the battlefield. Crews begged for recovery vehicles that didn't exist. Some tanks were blown up by their own men to avoid capture, not because of battle, but because they simply couldn't move anymore. One German crewman later recalled, "We feared the enemy's guns less than we feared our own transmission." Another admitted they carried extra oil and spare parts inside the tank, knowing they would break down long before meeting the enemy. So when American crews finally captured a fully intact King Tiger near La Gleize, the excitement in the air was genuine. Soldiers climbed over it like archaeologists studying an extinct creature. Yes, it was powerful. Yes, it was terrifying. But inside the engine compartment lay the truth. A design so over-engineered, so rushed, and so poorly maintained by a starving war economy that it could barely move under its own weight. The King Tiger's reputation had been built on fear. Its reality was built on fragility. And as one American tanker famously remarked, standing beside the broken behemoth, "Some kings wear crowns. This one wore a tow cable." When British engineers introduced the Cromwell tank, they believed they had finally built a machine that could outrun German armor and outmaneuver anything the Wehrmacht deployed. It was fast, incredibly fast. On open ground, a Cromwell could reach speeds close to 40 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest tanks of World War II. Crews loved the speed. They said it flew more than it rolled. But in the chaos of real battle, speed alone was never enough. The Cromwell first proved itself during the Normandy campaign in 1944. British crews raced across the French hedgerows, surprising German units with sudden flanking maneuvers. Reconnaissance units praised its agility, able to dart around enemy fire and reposition within seconds. Speed kept many crews alive, but it couldn't save them from the tank's fatal weakness: thin armor and a gun too small to deal with German heavy tanks. The Cromwell carried a 75mm gun, effective against infantry and light vehicles but nearly useless against Panthers and Tigers. British crews learned this the hard way. In one recorded encounter near Villers-Bocage, a Cromwell troop spotted a Tiger eye across a field. Before the Cromwells could even fire, the Tiger knocked out 2 of them with precise shots, its armor shrugging off every round they attempted to return. The Cromwells were simply too light to fight, too fragile to withstand hits, and too undergunned to challenge Germany's armored giants. Survivors from these engagements often described the same chilling feeling: seeing their shells spark harmlessly off German armor while enemy fire tore through their own thin plating like paper. Crews avoided direct engagements, relying instead on speed and flanking, hoping to catch German tanks distracted or exposed. "We were hunters only when the enemy wasn't looking," one British gunner later wrote. Mechanically, the Cromwell was a solid and reliable machine. Unlike the German tanks, it rarely broke down. But its strength on paper didn't match the brutal reality of tank warfare in 1944. Germany's heavy armor didn't fear the Cromwell. they barely acknowledged it. And yet, despite its shortcomings, the Cromwell became a symbol of British determination. What the tank lacked in firepower, its crews compensated with courage, improvisation, and sheer will. They used its speed to strike supply lines, chase retreating infantry, and exploit breakthroughs where heavier tanks couldn't follow. But the truth remained. Speed could save a tank, but it couldn't win a duel. In a battlefield ruled by tigers, panthers, and the rising dominance of American Shermans, the Cromwell was a capable machine misplaced in a war that demanded both strength and firepower. Years later, a veteran summarized it perfectly. The Cromwell was a racehorse in a world that needed warhorses. Beautiful to drive, terrible to fight in. When American crews first received the M4 Sherman in North Africa, they didn't expect it to become a legend. It wasn't the biggest tank on the battlefield. It didn't have the thick armor of a tiger, nor the intimidating gun of a panther. But what it did have was something far more valuable in a real war: the ability to keep moving when everything else broke down. One of the most famous stories came from the 2nd Armored Division during the long advance from Normandy to the German border. A single Sherman named Courageous Lady rolled more than 2,000 miles with the same engine, same transmission, and the same track links it had landed with on D-Day. Crews joked that the tank was held together by luck and coffee, but the truth was far simpler. The Sherman was built to survive constant use. The secret was its mechanical simplicity. The radial engine, adapted from aircraft design, ran smooth even in thick Normandy mud. While German tanks often overheated or snapped gearboxes, the Sherman's powertrain tolerated dust, sand, and rain with almost stubborn loyalty. One mechanic famously said, "If a Sherman wakes up in the morning, it will walk to Berlin." During the race across France, American columns sometimes moved so fast that German defenders believed they were fighting multiple armored divisions at once. In reality, it was the same units. Their Shermans just refused to stop. Crews recounted how they drove day and night, sometimes only turning the engine off once every 48 hours for a short maintenance check. Fuel, not breakdowns, became the only thing slowing them down. In Belgium, near Mons, a Sherman crew encountered a captured Panther abandoned at a crossroads. The German machine had snapped a final drive gear after only a few kilometers. His crew had walked away in frustration. The American tankers laughed, then drove their own Sherman over the same muddy road, without even noticing the terrain. To them, it felt like any other patch of European countryside. But endurance came with a price. Sherman crews knew the tank could burn easily when hit. They understood its armor wasn't perfect. Yet many preferred it because they trusted it to carry them through the worst days of the war. "A tank is only useful if it shows up," one crewman said years later. The Sherman showed up every single day. By the time American forces reached the Rhine, the legend was sealed. The Shermans had traveled farther, fought longer, and endured more punishment than anyone in the War Department had predicted. They weren't glamorous, but they were unstoppable, the iron workhorses of the Allied victory. And when the final miles toward victory came, thousands of Shermans were still rolling, engines rumbling like tired but determined giants, proving once and for all why they became the greatest endurance machines of World War II. In the final years of World War II, Allied and German crews learned one painful truth. On the battlefield, raw power meant nothing if a tank couldn't keep moving. Stories from both fronts showed the same pattern. The strongest tanks often failed long before they ever reached the fight. One of the clearest examples came during the Battle of the Bulge. German commanders deployed their mighty Tiger II tanks, each weighing nearly 70 tons and armed with a gun capable of destroying an enemy from over 2 kilometers away. On paper, they were invincible. In reality, many never even made it to the front. Engines overheated, fuel pumps failed, and final drive gears shattered under the tank's weight. Some crews reported spending more time repairing than fighting. A few Tigers were abandoned after only a short road march, their power useless without mobility. Meanwhile, American armor columns pushed through snow and ice in vehicles the Germans mocked as inferior. But the reliable engines of the Sherman and the lightweight construction of the M18 Hellcat allowed them to maneuver quickly, outflank positions, and strike where enemy defenses were weakest. Their practicality, not strength, became the deciding factor. One American tanker recalled driving over 20 hours straight without a breakdown, something no German heavy tank could dream of. Another story came from Normandy, where Panther tanks, considered one of Germany's best designs, suffered from delicate transmissions. Some broke down after hitting only a small ditch or climbing a hill at the wrong angle. Mechanics worked day and night, but parts were scarce, and towing a 30-ton machine under enemy fire was nearly impossible. As a result, many Panthers were destroyed by their own crews just to prevent capture. Their power became a burden, not an advantage. By contrast, British and Canadian armored units relied on Cromwells and Shermans that might not have been impressive individually, but they moved steadily hour after hour. Crews trusted them. They didn't fear sudden mechanical betrayal. When miles mattered more than armor thickness, these ordinary tanks accomplished what the monsters of steel could not. The Eastern Front offered its own harsh lesson. The Soviet T-34, simple and brutally practical, kept operating through mud, snow, and burned-out villages. German soldiers were shocked to see it crawl over terrain where heavier tanks sank like stones. It was like fighting a ghost. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "You knock it down. Another appears, and another." The reason was not magic, it was practicality, easy maintenance, and reliability. By 1945, the conclusion was undeniable. A tank's value came not from the size of its gun or the thickness of its plates, but from its ability to fight where and when it was needed. Power was impressive. Practicality won wars. And as the engines finally fell silent across Europe, the tanks that survived were not always the strongest, just the ones that kept moving when everything else failed. By the middle of 1944, soldiers on every front had learned a truth that didn't appear in manuals or blueprints. The best tank wasn't the heaviest, the fastest, or even the most powerful. It was the one that could reach the battlefield when it mattered. American forces discovered this during the race across France. After the breakout from Normandy, armored divisions moved day and night, covering distances the Germans never thought possible. Shermans rumbled through villages, over hedgerows, and across bomb-cratered roads. They weren't unstoppable, they weren't elegant, but they were present. One U.S. tanker recalled passing 3 abandoned German tanks for every one destroyed in combat. "We didn't beat them," he said. "Their machines beat themselves." On the German side, the frustration was impossible to ignore. Reports from the Western Front describe Panthers and Tigers bogged down in soft ground or sidelined by broken transmissions. Some crews spent more hours towing their own vehicles than fighting the enemy. In one infamous case during the Ardennes offensive, a Tiger II ran out of fuel only a few kilometers after departing. It never fired a shot. The crew destroyed it to prevent capture, leaving behind a giant that never had the chance to roar. British commanders faced a similar reality in Italy. Terrain there favored maneuverable machines, not heavy beasts of armor. Cromwell and Sherman units managed to climb mountain paths, ford streams, and reposition quickly in response to German attacks. Meanwhile, German heavy tanks often became trapped in narrow passes or overheated during slow climbs. Their power meant nothing when the landscape refused to cooperate. But perhaps the clearest example came from the Eastern Front. The T-34, rugged and simple, was rarely the most impressive tank on paper. Yet it appeared everywhere, in the mud of spring, the dust of summer, and the frozen hell of winter. German officers wrote that Soviet tanks seemed to regenerate after every battle. What they didn't fully understand was that the T-34's ease of repair and ability to operate in extreme conditions allowed the Red Army to keep fighting long after more complex machines would have been abandoned. A Soviet mechanic once joked, "If a T-34 breaks, we fix it with a hammer. If a Panther breaks, the Germans need a factory." The comment was exaggerated, but the outcome was real. Tanks that were simple survived. Tanks that were over-engineered stalled, overheated, or ran out of spare parts. By 1945, the pattern was obvious to anyone who had served in armored units. The machines that shaped the outcome of the war were not necessarily the strongest, but the most reliable. A tank sitting powerless on the roadside was just a steel coffin. A tank that arrived at the fight, even with thinner armor, saved lives, broke enemy lines, and changed the course of entire offensives. And that became the lasting lesson of the war. The tank that wins is not the one with the biggest gun, but the one that actually shows up.